So I'm going to talk to you about, and I'll be quick and I'll be hopefully entertaining, the startup that came out of my research at the MIT Media Lab down the street, which is part of the Startup Exchange, and that's how I get connected to ILP, is called Sourcemap. Here it is. And it's a company that was really born, and I'll tell you the trajectory because it's very interesting, out of transparency and sustainability, which was not something that was meant to be good for business. Actually grown into quite a nice little business because we were able to take the lessons we learned in those kind of emerging spaces and apply them to general supply chain management. My trajectory starts very simply sort of as a graduate student. I was designing a lot of products and I was constantly in the sort of questioning of, what materials should I use, what technologies are appropriate, what's the right choice when designing products. And this was around 2007. This is problematic. If I'm an engineer at the Media Lab and I don't know whether something is the greenest or the least green, except if I look it up online and see ads. And so I thought I would just dive in and figure out exactly what green is. And the first thing I did was take apart my own laptop. And actually you see on a kind of an artistic project, I etched on the laptop a map of where all the different pieces that were in it came from. Long story short, there's a lot of pieces in a laptop and it comes from a lot of places. And I decided to start diving in and say, what does it mean to be green, or what does it mean to be ethical? And I decided, okay, we're gonna tool, and it's gonna allow any product to be mapped and all of the environmental and social conditions in which it was produced to be easily accessible by anyone. And in 2008, we released a website, really was just that. We had just gotten the Google Maps API, which means you could use Google Maps in your website. And I drew on top of it, we developed a way to draw supply chains on top of Google Maps. Very simple. And the idea was just that. It would be informative, it would be a good resource for journalists and students and NGOs, and it would allow you to really think hard about exactly how products are made. It turns out SAP wasn't using GPS at that time. It turns out actually nobody was using GPS to map supply chains, and it turns out nobody was mapping supply chains to the raw material either. Actually, it turns out that's still the case. Blew up because this little website that was made for the students at MIT got picked up by the Huffington Post. So all of a sudden we had thousands of people making maps, and so I decided, okay, what are we going to do to make this useful? A buddy of mine who runs a restaurant catering business up the street in Cambridge came over and he said, I see you're making maps of computers. Can I make maps of food? Because I am really proud of how I source my food. This was back when local sourcing was a big deal. And he said, but I want to be different from my competitors. I want to actually show people where I source locally and what I don't source locally. Because everybody says locally sourced whenever possible, which means nothing, especially because you can't grow citrus or olive oil or any variety of things up here anyways, ever. So he said, I'm going to actually show it. I'm actually going to change the menu every month. So all of a sudden we thought, okay, maybe an application for this technology is local food. And we're going to add a widget to the software where you could actually figure out the carbon footprint of various products by comparing where they were made and how far they were shipped. There was a lot of talk about sourcing locally to reduce carbon footprint. I think in this example, actually, a product can be sourced from much, much farther away and actually be more sustainable if sourcing it from over there means it has less energy involved in producing it. So that did not go exactly where it was planned, but it was only the first of many pivots that we had. So it turns out local, no good. But the idea that a business would use supply chain transparency to promote itself in front of its competitors was starting to appear. And in fact, Stonyfield was one of the first companies to come to us and say, we want to make our organic supply chain transparent. And we worked with them, and their graphic designers ended up totally taking over the project and making it really cutesy. But that being said, they were early to the game, and for brands, like Robert's restaurant or like Stonyfield that already associate as being good for the world, it seemed like a good thing. So still an NGO, still kind of an academic project. And if you go to this website, it's called open.sourcemap.com. You'll see thousands of supply chain maps that have been uploaded by people, and a lot of them by companies. And we never expected Chiquita would be one of the first companies to just publish its supply chain on our website back in 2012. But it turns out they were very proud because they actually own everything from the farm to the distribution center. So they're an unusually integrated company. And so with every one of those steps, they were able to say exactly who was doing it, why they chose them, and what they were doing to make it better. So this was interesting because all of a sudden, unusual suspects began appearing. Bruce Arnson, who directs the master's program, actually works for Yossi, who I think you saw, or you will see tomorrow. He came to me and he said, Leo, I know you're making lots of drawings of maps of where things come from, but do you know how much time we spend at the Center for Logistics actually drawing these things out in PowerPoint, arrow by arrow, dot by dot? And in fact, this is one of Bruce's drawings, which I really love. And you should see how long it takes him to make these. It's kind of fun to watch. He said, look, I know you're making things for sustainability and transparency, but can you come over and help some of our sponsors actually map their supply chains so that they can keep their business alive? And so thank God for Bruce. He basically got us started. And what we ended up doing with his guidance was basically coming up with a simple formula for how to measure the risk of every piece of your supply chain based on essentially how long it would take you to find an alternate source of that material. So very simple. So it's the oxygen sensor. If you depend on one source for 100% of a part that all your products depend on, you lose them, and it takes a year to replace them, you lose a year of revenue. And then variations on that. So he said, look, we can do this. And he thought, we can probably do it with data companies already have in SAP, in some form or another. And so we spent 2.5 years working with Procter & Gamble and Church & Dwight to get enough people in the company to share enough spreadsheets so that we could prove that this was in fact possible. And then we built a translator to do that, and it was able to do some pretty powerful things. It was able to map all the inventory that a company has all over the world just by getting data feeds from SAP on a regular refresh. And then it was able to calculate for every single raw material exactly what the revenue risk was. So if you lose that vendor, this is this many dollars of lost revenue because you won't be able to produce and you won't be able to supply your customers for this many days. Actually quite simple, but it was the first time that somebody could say, instead of prioritizing those high spend vendors, which is what everyone prioritizes, they're able to look at the whole supply chain, and every day the data refreshed. Not that you needed to see it every day, but when the hurricane comes, our servers go crazy because all the companies are going in there saying, what do we have there? What's going on? And then getting on the phone. And this was something that just wasn't doable. Actually, for years, Mars is a manufacturer. So they buy cocoa from a wholesaler. And they don't have anyone, presumably, they don't buy anything directly from farms. It's like 3-4 steps removed. 50,000 farmers were mapped within the first 2 years. Now 160,000 are mapped and updated every quarter for Mars. Not just by Mars, but by all of the suppliers to Mars who want to sell to Mars. So this is something that particular industry has gone from 0 visibility to, say, 100% visibility on all certified farms, and probably a 30 or 40% visibility on the 2 million farms that exist in the world in a span of 5 years. And I usually hold up cocoa to any other industry that says, we have a really hard time with our supply chain mapping. Believe me, these places are hard to get to. The real innovation of that industry is that now the commodity of cocoa, which is one of the classic commodities, is not a commodity because one pallet of cocoa that comes with traceability is actually worth 10% more than a pallet of the same exact stuff that doesn't have that information package. But we're finally at a stage where there's information moving faster than products, and that information means that things are worth a different amount, and that just to play, right, if you're going to go to a company that's saying 100% certified, just to play ball, you have to raise your standards. I don't need to sell you any more on supply chain transparency. So also because you have no choice now. I think there's so many regulations that just cropped up in the last 5 or 6 years about modern slavery and vigilance, which is a new law if you want to sell in France, that you have to declare that you know where all your products were made. So it's become a kind of a matter of course. And I just close with this, which is a story of sort of one B2B business that's starting to use transparency actually to become a B2C brand. It's like Intel Inside, right? That super successful campaign that makes people care about a B2B product. This is a company that sells fabric that goes into the lining of boots that are sold by Timberland. The company's called Thread International. They have a social story about how the plastic is collected, recycled, milled, and sold. But this is their website, right? They use one of our free online maps as an embed in their product. So they're trying to create a consciousness that, you'll go by Timberland because you know the lining was responsibly sourced. And so this is what I think ultimately is the coolest part of all this, which is when businesses actually compete on the basis of how transparent and sustainable they are.